welcome to the CEC Report. It's April 20, I'm Robert Barwick, and I'm joined again by CEC leader Craig Isherwood. Welcome, Craig.
Thanks, Robbie.
In today's CEC Report, the future of Australia, develop or die? Who killed the Australian-made car, Hawke and Keating? And finally, as Spain sinks, more turn to Glass-Steagall. So first, the future of Australia, develop or die. This CEC report is the forum in which we're going to launch a special new CEC initiative in the form of a rallying cry to all Australians in which we've put out a resolution which we were distributing, asking people to endorse it, asking organisations, individuals right across Australia to endorse this as a formal resolution. And the purpose of this resolution is to clearly define the political fight that must be waged if the destruction of Australia's economy is to be reversed. And what we mean by that is that the solution to Australia's economic crisis is not merely enacting some new policies to improve the present situation. It is a realisation that we must undo every single economic and environmental reform that's been passed in Australia since Bob Hawke and Paul Keating in 1983. In other words, all the so-called reforms that are crowed about by the leaders of both sides as being the cause of the prosperity of Australia, which we say is a fraud, they all must go. So I'm going to read to you the resolution and then we'll discuss it. The future of Australia, develop or die. Whereas the presently ruling policies of globalisation, privatisation, deregulation and free trade, together with the enforcement of environmentalist policies so radical that they are best described as green fascism, are plunging the vast majority of Australians, along with most of the rest of the world, into poverty and misery, destroying our once great nation and eliminating any meaningful future for our children. Be it therefore resolved, 1. That the entire body of globalist economic reforms introduced by the Hawke-Keating regimes beginning 1983 and relentlessly expanded since then be scrapped, together with the equally murderous radical environmentalist legislation enacted since that time. 2. That this nation return to the traditional protectionist, well-regulated form of agro-industrial economy under which we once flourished, typified by the agreement and outlook between old Labor, as exemplified by Australian Labor Party Prime Ministers John Curtin and Ben Chifley on the one hand, and Country Party leader and long-time Trade and Industries Minister John Blackjack McEwen on the other hand. 3. That we must re-regulate our national financial system upon two essential pillars. A. The immediate separation of sound commercial banking which benefits the average Australian from the speculative merchant banking activities which have grown like a cancer under financial deregulation, both in this country and worldwide, and which have largely caused the present ever-deepening global financial crisis. The well-known precedent for such a separation is the 1933 United States Glass-Steagall Act, which President Franklin Delano Roosevelt used to bring his nation and the world out of the Great Depression, and whose adoption is presently being debated in numerous countries around the world. B. The immediate re-establishment of a new government-owned national bank to provide credit for urgently needed great infrastructure projects as the engine to drive a great new renaissance in our agro-industrial physical economy. We must have a sovereign Australian national credit system, not a London, Wall Street controlled monetarist system, to enable us to secure the well-being of all Australians instead of just the privileged few as under the present monetarist system. 4. That we, the undersigned, will exert our utmost efforts to bring these reforms into reality now. So that's the wording of the resolution. Craig, what do you say to people who think that the reforms that we're targeting here are entrenched and so there's nothing we can do?
Well, just the first comment, Robbie. Yesterday, Joe Hawke came out and called for a smaller welfare state and a smaller government, which means he's basically going to cut the money going to pensioners and to those who need it most on the basis of we can't afford it. This is the result of those policies. So people are going to suffer as a result of the now 30, 40 years of globalist deregulation policies. But I think it's really important that people get a sense of the different types or the different policy directions that were taken under Hawke and Keating. And I'll preface it by saying that Hawke and Keating were both Fabian socialists. They were both members of the Australian Fabian Society. And people must know that the Fabian Society was founded by the likes of Beatrice and Sidney Webb and H.G. Wells and others, specifically as a vehicle to destroy the optimism of economic development coming out of the Lincoln Revolution, where he used the Great Continental Railroad, and you saw an great upshift in the rate of expansion of population in the US as a result of his optimistic policies. So the British Crown personally funded the formation of the Fabian Society, and it's no wonder these sorts of policies that are coming through via the Fabians, Keating and Hawke are destroying our nation. So what were those policies? Well, we're looking at, I've got them here. We're looking at, first of all, a dollar float, 1983, I think it was.
Yep.
You know, float the dollar. This was in concert with a lot of nations around the world. It was a result of Nixon floating the dollar in 1971, but it turned the world into a global casino. Yep. And what we have now is $1.4 quadrillion worth of derivatives and speculative instruments that are literally sinking countries as we see in Europe. So
once upon a time, most currency trading was to facilitate trade of goods and services. Now, far less than 1% of currency trading is for that. The rest is speculation.
Just pure speculation. That's the first policy, right? The second is bank deregulation, right? We moved, particularly under the direction of Macquarie Bank, right, to deregulate the entire banking system. You saw the build up of the property bubble by the banks for the first homeowners grants and all that sort of thing, and you've seen numerous financial scandals ever since that period, right?
Yeah, the policies that ran up the bank debt in Australia would originate with that bank deregulation.
Yeah, and then we move over to the union busting, the union consolidation. A lot of functional smaller unions were shut down in favour of amalgamation, which means more control top down, less representation for the membership, and I think we're going to come to our next point, what that actually means for the Australian worker.
And what it did, and the reason they did it, Paul Keating and Bill Kelty worked on this, it was to sideline the union movement so they wouldn't fight these anti-worker reforms.
Yeah, right. Exactly right. I mean, now take privatisation, right? This is a shifting of public-owned assets into private hands. Look at, for example, things like CityLink, 100-year contracts to Macquarie Bank in order to generate an income stream which goes to private hands. This is the nature of what was taking place in that period. Tariff cuts, another very important thing, where the reduction of tariff has literally destroyed a lot of the manufacturing capability of our country, and I think we'll say more about that shortly. Compulsory superannuation, which is a real sore point. Now, $1.4 trillion now of people's money is tied up in the banking system, which is why it was established in the first place, to prop up and continue a cash stream into the banking system, to keep it propped up, because we know our banking system is very, very fragile at the point of imploding right now. And the other problem is, you can see how many people have lost their money in the recent period because the amount of speculative activity allowed by these superannuation funds into the share market, for example, has resulted in a lot of people losing their money.
And they don't realise that poor schmucks is they're propping up the markets.
Yeah. And you talk about national competition policy. This was a policy to basically, it's microeconomic reform, in order to make government departments and entities of government act like the private industries. The government isn't private industry. It's there for the general welfare. It operates to different principles of the general welfare, and consequently you're seeing the shutdown of services that used to be taken for granted based upon a monetaristic outlook. Yeah, this is the sorts of economic reforms that have taken place under Hawke and Keating. There's been others under Howard and Costello, like, for example, the fully independent Reserve Bank. Don't have time to go through a lot of these things. You've seen the GST brought in.
But the thing is, when you go through each reform, if you go back to my question, it's not a case of these reforms are entrenched, therefore there's nothing we can do about them. If we don't, if you go through each reform and actually examine it, each one has done so much damage that they all have to go.
That's right, and it's a policy direction that you have to choose from the top down. Are we going to have a country, a sovereign country, or are we going to allow private financial interests at the end to completely dictate how our country operates?
And when we come back, we're going to talk about a case example of what we're talking about in the car industry. Welcome back to the CEC Report. So now we're going to talk about the subject, who killed the Australian-made car? Hawke and Keating, that's who. So this week, 350 Toyota workers were frog-marched out of their jobs, and they have the doyens of the union movement and the Labor Party to blame for it, namely Paul Keating and Bob Hawke. The ongoing erosion of Australia's manufacturing sector, where on a weekly basis now we're seeing whole chunks, it's like an iceberg breaking up, right? Whole chunks breaking off and sinking, submerging, is Exhibit A in the case that we're making about these globalist reforms and that we're attacking in our resolution. Because manufacturing is not just another sector of the economy, right? It's the heart of any advanced economy. Now, in all the attention that was given this week over the Toyota sackings, and that got a lot of attention, but you also had these APV job losses here in Coburg, where we're based. The attention was given to the way the sackings were handled, the use of security, the fact that Toyota got a $280 million injection from the government, and that didn't save these jobs, etc., and the difficulty that these older type workers will have in getting new jobs. However, nothing was said about the cause. And the cause of this is very straightforward. It is free trade. We have dropped the tariff wall under which we built up a car industry, and so we are losing the car industry. And this goes back to 1989, when Bob Hawke and Paul Keating acted on a Ross Garnaut report, the man of climate change fame, to start slashing tariffs. And because of that, manufacturing in that period has collapsed from more than 20% of our economy to less than 10%. And one problem, Craig, is that the union leaders who are supposed to represent the car industry workers and who are wringing their hands, they're crying crocodile tears because by not breaking with the Labor Party and fighting for tariffs, they're betraying the workers that they're supposed to be representing. So let's talk about the theory, though, behind free trade. The economic theory is that tariffs make imports more expensive, which allows local production to be more expensive, and in turn makes exports more expensive, and that reduces our competitiveness. Craig, the assumption here is that our purpose as a nation is to export.
Right.
Isn't that the flaw?
Well, totally, because the purpose of the exports is to export your surplus, Robbie. Surplus of your net physical economic output, not to export for the sake of exporting. And the problem is, look, what you said there before, right, that tariffs make imports more expensive. They should. Why? It's because local production, particularly here in Australia, is more expensive. It's just a reality. And I want to highlight this with a very...
And we should be proud of that.
No, we should be, because look, let's take a very concrete example. Let's take, and I didn't know that we still manufactured white goods in Australia, but we do. Apparently Electrolux has a plant at Orange in New South Wales. It employs 600 people. Now, Fisher & Paykel used to employ about 300 people in Cleveland up until 2009, but it shut down its entire manufacturing operations in Australia and New Zealand and moved them to Thailand and to Mexico. Now, have a look at the example. 600 people in Orange, New South Wales, and I don't know how many extra people attached to that whole supply chain is involved, are paid between $44,000 and $88,000 per year. So that's the sort of money that's coming into the local economy, about $27 to $40 million. You go to Thailand, the wage of the average manufacturing worker in Thailand is $11,000 to $15,000 per year. So Fisher & Paykel, right, are producing refrigerators and white goods in Thailand and basically shipping that good in, right, at so-called cheaper prices, because the cheaper prices are possible because of the much, much cheaper labour. But so by doing that, you're undercutting those 600 workers that are getting a decent wage at $44,000 to $88,000, and you're literally forcing those sorts of producers, our Australian producers, to the wall. So that's the way that free trade works. It says we have to have absolute freedom in free trade to make sure we maximise the profits for our shareholders, which is exactly the reason Fisher and Paykel went to Thailand and to Mexico. So you're paying third world, we're buying goods produced by third world labour.
And instead of the money staying here and circulating around in the form of wages, it's going, we're giving it to the companies and they're taking it to their offshore tax havens. And also the workers in poor Thailand who aren't getting paid properly are effectively giving up their wealth as well.
That's the problem. None of this wealth stays within the countries. Now, with the tariff, you put a tariff on imported white goods, a very high tariff, as far as I'm concerned, 50%. So instead of a washing machine coming in at $700, it's going to cost $400.
The stock market by saying that. But
well, that's fine. But a washing machine is sold, for $700 because it's made from cheap labour. Now goes to $1,400. Electrolux is today not only producing washing machines, it's also producing stoves and other goods. Well-known iconic brands. Westinghouse, Kelvinator, Simpson, Electrolux are all made here in Australia by Electrolux. So people have a choice. They can buy those brands and support Australian jobs because Electrolux is operating under a free trade arrangement. So their margins are very, very slim. They'd have to be. Whereas Fisher and Paykel are using slave labour, in effect, compared to real average labour, comparatively speaking, and they're just basically lining their pockets of their company. Now, this is the way free trade works. It's got nothing to do with the benefit for the local citizenry of or employees of local countries. It's got everything to do with maximising the profit of multinational corporations.
Now, this debate, Craig, has a long history, and we're going to talk more about it in the future. But there's been an erosion since the high water mark in the 60s when Blackjack McEwen, who had spent 2 decades keeping the industrialisation of Australia going, that Curtin and Chifley had embarked on in World War II. And once he was out of the way, we've gone from we were about 30% of manufacturing was about 30% of the overall economy then, and now we're down to about 8%. And what do we achieve by losing these factories, by losing these jobs? We don't. You
lose sovereignty, Robbie. I mean, you lose the capacity to be able to actually defend yourself, for one thing, but also, I take the example of under the washing machine, right? If you're importing, if you shut down all of the capacity to produce washing machines in Australia, right, and you used to be able to produce a washing machine, say, for $1,000, right? But that here in Australia-made washing machines for $1,000, but they're importing Chinese ones for $400, right? So there's a number of $400 washing machines come on the market. Well, that's good. You shut down your local production, you don't produce them here, then there's some sort of conflagration, some sort of a war. Look, Obama's trying to push a war with China right now. What happens when there's no washing machines? What do you think the price of washing machines is going to do when there's no washing machines? It's going to go through the roof. And I can see this scenario where a couple of millionaires will pay $1 million for a washing machine because their wife is complaining about having to do them by hand.
And short of a war, though, even the skills that you have by being involved in an industry like the washing machine, the skills that are concentrated, then get to disperse throughout the rest of the economy. And when you give up your manufacturing that easy, you're actually giving up that capacity.
That's what John Curtin, Chifley and McEwen knew. In the war, we had very little manufacturing capacity, and we had to build it up real quick.
Yep. All right. So we'll leave it there. When we come back, our final point, we're going to talk about an example of the consequences globally of what we've just spent quite a bit of time discussing, which is the financial crisis in Spain and its impact on the rest of the world. Welcome back to the CEC Report. And finally, as Spain sinks, more turn to Glass-Steagall. So Spain is now the epicenter of the world financial crisis, and as we predicted, it's a far greater problem than Greece or Ireland. And we've seen all the worries that those two have caused in the last 2 years. The Spanish banks hold debt that is 300% of the nation's GDP. And what's interesting about the Spanish situation, Craig, is that it's similar to Australia in the sense that all the debt is not held by the government, but it's held by the banks, the foreign debt. The centre of the banking crisis is the Rothschilds Inter Alpha Group bank, Banco Santander. And what that means is, as it collapses, it ripples out through the whole inter-alpha network that's spread like an octopus worldwide. Here's the interesting thing, the City of London bankers and their IMF, European Central Bank lackeys would dearly love to bail the Spanish banks out, because of course that's what they do. But they've already spent all their ammunition on the unsuccessful bailouts of Greece and Ireland. And they cannot raise enough money, especially the IMF, to create another buffer. In the face of this, IMF Managing Director Christine Lagarde issued a call at the start of this week for a stronger firewall to contain the damage. And we are now seeing the word Glass-Steagall being discussed all across Europe. So, and Craig, my question for you, isn't that lawful that now people are turning to Glass-Steagall?
There is no other solution, Robbie. I mean, you're talking about a world system that's got in excess of $1.4 quadrillion of debt in it. There's no way that debt can be paid. And I think what really is freaking out a lot of investors and people in the world today, and bankers in particular, is the size of the Spanish problem. Look, Greece has a GDP, I don't like GDP figures, but nonetheless, relatively speaking, GDP of $300 billion with a population of 11 million people. Spain has a GDP of $1.5 trillion with a population of 46 million people. So you have a 5 times greater problem with Spain than you do with Greece. And it took $280 billion, which is nearly the entirety of Greece's GDP in 1 year, to meet the debt obligations to try and save Greece. How are they going to find the equivalent of 1.5, well, you said, 300% of the nation's GDP.
4.5.
That's $4.5 trillion, Robbie. I mean, it doesn't take much to see how this 1.4 quadrillion comes up if you take all the economies of the world and start to add together, the private and public debt. It's absolutely phenomenal. So how are you going to deal with this? Well, you have to go back with a political principle and say, we are going to protect the sovereignty of nations. The governments have to act for the interests of their nations and not for the private financiers of the British monetary system that have gorged themselves with this debt. And we have to say, okay, that's it. We are not paying or not acknowledging any speculative debt from anywhere. And you create a literal firewall, not the one that she's talking about, Christine Lagarde, but a firewall based upon the principles of Franklin Roosevelt's 1933 Glass-Steagall. And you say, well, this debt here, it's part of the productive economy. It's got to be serviced because that is got a real basis upon which it's existed. This other paper debt, the derivatives, all these things like interest rate swaps and credit default swaps, and all that are based on the casino economy, that's rubbish. That's paper. It's not going to get paid. So you protect the legitimate banking system through legislation, and you basically give back the debt to the private banking system. And if those private banks go under because of the debt, well then so be it. But you do protect the banking system as a whole, and you protect those legitimate banks that are involved in legitimate commerce and so forth. And you do see some of the banks already firewalling themselves internally and trying to separate out that debt from the legitimate side of their business. They know this is going on. So the point
they're coming around to it, but they better realise that they just may as well drop all their objections and do it.
It requires a decision of government first and foremost.
Yep. All right, well, we're going to leave it there. Just to make a point about the resolution we started with at the beginning, the spirit of that resolution is the fight that we need you, the viewer, to participate in. If you're not already involved in the CEC, get involved. The future of our national economy is at stake. This is going to turn the political fight in Australia on its head. So contact us and become part of it. Thank you.